in our community and wanting to be more present as an organization and doing all that work juntos together. And now I'll turn it over to our president-elect, the person who will be our president of CFSA next academic year, Rachel Fernandez, who will introduce today's topic and our special guest presenter.
All right, thank you, Kevin, and hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today in our October meeting. As Kevin mentioned, we have a guest speaker today, and I'll just do a little introduction and then we'll let him take the show. So today we'll have Alberto Olivas. He is the founding director of the Congressman Ed Pastor's Center for Politics and Public Service, located in the Watts College of Public Service and Community Solutions. Prior to coming to ASU, Alberto worked for the Maricopa County Community College District as a director for the Center of Civic Participation and also as vice president of the Arizona Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. Along with these two prestigious roles, he has also served in different leadership positions in the Office of Equal Opportunity, State Voter Outreach, and the Arizona Commission of Indian Affairs. For today, Alberto will be presenting research findings and recommendations related to increasing voter participation and by students and young voters. He will also explain how one of the ballot measures, in particular, Prop 308, could affect Dreamers and DACA students if approved by voters. At the end of this presentation, we'll have some time for questions, but please feel free to input them in the chat and we'll make sure to get to them. And with that, I'll pass it on to Alberto. Alberto, will you have any slides I can? Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing and we'll let me come there.
Thank you. Good morning. So just for some context, I've been doing these presentations for, I was trying to add it up, almost 25 years. So way back in the late 90s, I was lifelong Democrat hired by a Republican Secretary of State, Betsy Bayless, to be the first voter outreach director for Arizona. It was a new idea, pretty new at the time, for states to do more than just run elections, that state election offices should actually put some effort into educating voters about the process and about what was on the ballot in every specific election. So we started doing this roadshow explaining to voters everything you need to know about voting and answering questions. And I've been doing versions of that ever since, working with tribes and schools, colleges, universities, and business organizations and so forth. So I really like doing these presentations because it always elicits so much fascinating discussion. And even people that are from Arizona, have lived here, grown up here, been voting for a long time, always so that they find things out or they didn't realize certain things. So it's just, it's really good to talk to voters specifically about what to expect. And that relates to the question of what makes for someone that votes and doesn't vote, specifically within the Latino community. So I've been tracking research about voter behavior for all this time. And there's one thing that's pretty constant throughout all of the studies and surveys and focus groups and town halls and things. The main reason people don't vote in elections that are eligible to vote, it's not necessarily that they're cynical or that they think their vote doesn't count. The main reason that keeps people from voting is lack of information. And that's as true for Latinos as for anybody else. So in many ways, Latino voters are not significantly different from other voters, except to the extent to which they receive less information than many other voters. And there's a lot of reasons for that. So I'm hopeful that today's conversation will give you the tools to be able to figure out how to explain these things to people in your sphere of influence, particularly young Latinos, particularly first-time voters, if possible. Just because otherwise the process can seem really intimidating and mystifying and confusing. And confused voters don't vote. Underinformed voters don't vote. So the main reason someone might not vote in the city of Tempe city council elections, even if they're really involved in community things in Tempe, is if they don't have enough information to know who the candidates are that are running for city council or what they stand for. So again and again, we keep coming up to this issue. The voters don't feel like they understand enough to make an informed decision. Overwhelmingly, they don't participate. So the converse is true. The more we can arm voters with the sense that, okay, now I get it. I understand what's at stake, what this means. Then voters will, despite their cynicism, despite bitterness, despite obstacles, process barriers, they'll overcome those if they feel a personal and emotional response to something that's going to be determined in the election. So it's important to acknowledge, yes, especially in our community, a lot of our young people are fairly cynical about elections in Arizona, or suspect, maybe everything's not on the up and up with how we run elections. But if you can convey to them what's at stake and why it matters and how important it is for any specific thing that's going to be determined in the ballot, then overwhelmingly they tend to participate. And the good news is that since 1972, when 1972 was the first time 18-year-olds could vote in this country. It used to be you had to be 21 to vote. But because of the Vietnam War, we were sending 18-year-olds overseas. Congress passed an act to lower the voting age to 72. And there was a huge, to 18 in 1972. And there was a huge turnout among young voters in that year. And ever since then, I think it's not a surprise, the turnout rate of young people has been decreasing steadily until recently. So starting with the Obama's first presidential campaign, that's when we saw a spike in youth voting. And then it kind of subsided, but then it's been coming back during the Trump era. And up to now, we've seen steady increases in voter turnout by young people and by minorities. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. But one is just however you feel about President Trump and his administration and that whole time period, one clear outcome of that was that many groups that previously voted in very low numbers are starting to vote in super high numbers. And I think that's because a lot of constituencies on the left and the right feel very jeopardized, feel really like a lot is at stake. They feel personally worried about outcomes. And that's disturbing, but it's also good for turnout. So I feel a little weird saying that, but if we want to increase voter turnout among any group, one of the first things we need to do is drive home what's at stake in a way that has emotional response. So when voters are angry or scared or excited about something that could happen, they turn out to vote despite process barriers. So I'm going to talk briefly about the 10 questions that Arizona voters will be deciding this year, and focusing first on the one that I think is for many Latinos, at the top of the list in terms of what's at stake and how this affects our community. And feel free to put in the chat at any point any questions you have. I'll ask Rachel and or Kevin to kind of flag for me if there's a question or something for me to respond to. Okay, so let me go ahead and pull up my slides. But yeah, as I mentioned before, the turnout rate of young people is very encouragingly rising, especially among ASU students. So we're part of a national study of college voting behavior, and without getting into the details, we're able to get, after every election, a detailed report for our own students, for ASU students that are eligible to register to vote. So every election, we can track from election to election what ASU eligible student population looks like in terms of voter registration rates and voter turnout rates. And the youngest voters are the ones that have been increasing in the highest numbers. So 18 to 21-year-olds and first-year freshmen in the last election voted in higher numbers than grad students, which is unusual to say the least. But I think a big part of that is there's been a lot more on campus. You've probably seen it. A lot more events and things happening to talk up elections in the last few years. And it's just, I think, more front of mind for a lot of students because for good or for bad, because of policies, issues at the state and national level, and this kind of political moment that we're in. So it's a stressful time. And for many people, it's a sad time, but it's also a time that's awakening interest and energy and engagement among many young voters that otherwise wouldn't be necessarily voting in our elections. So you all can see my first slide, right? Correct? It says Arizona. Okay, good. That link at the bottom, if you received my email a little while ago with the worksheet, the second page of the worksheet has links to all of this stuff. So I encourage you to use these materials with your own families, with your own classes, with groups like that. So it's my hope that after I've gone through this, you'll see, oh, I can do this. The slides even are linked on the second page of that handout. So The first page is this worksheet, which I just prepared so you can take easy notes and then use that when you're filling out your ballot. Okay, so the first thing I'd like to explain is the numbering system for the ballot measures. Again, we have 10 questions that Arizona voters will be deciding, and the 100s mean it's a proposed change to our state's constitution. 200 mean it's a proposed initiative from the citizens initiative process. So in Arizona, if you're not from here, you might not know, anyone can propose a law and have voters vote on it. So if I thought it should be against the law, and I do think it should be against the law for restaurant owners to keep the tip money, I could propose that. As if you didn't know, that happens a lot. A lot of restaurants, it's terrible. You're paying your bill at the restaurant and you write in a tip amount. You're just going on faith that that money is going to go to your server, and it doesn't always. So if I felt strongly enough about it that I wanted to make it a law, all I need to do is formalize it, submit it as register it with the Secretary of State's office, and start getting petition signatures. And if I can get enough registered voters to sign my petition, then the Tips for Waiters Act by me would be on the ballot, and it would, all the voters in our state would get to vote on it. So that's the citizens initiative process. The 300s mean it's a law that's proposed and referred by the legislature for voters to decide. So sometimes it's politically the legislature doesn't want to take stand on a policy issue, and so they say, let's let the voters have the final call. And sometimes that's because by law they're not allowed to pass certain laws. For example, our legislature in Arizona can't increase their own pay. Voters have to approve a pay increase for legislators, and Arizona voters have refused to do that since 1994. So our legislature still only makes $24,000 a year because voters don't want to give them any more money. And then depending on where you live, you might see 400s on your ballot, and those are just local issues. But so I'm going to go out of sequence, starting with Proposition 308, because like I mentioned, this may be one that has the most obvious impact for a lot of our students and a lot of our Latino colleagues that we want to make sure are voting. So even if people feel despondent about maybe the governor's election or the Secretary of State's race, if you can get them to care about Prop 308, for example, or one of the other propositions, the voters will typically still vote if they feel like I can at least make a difference on this one question. Does that make sense? So for me, talking about ballot questions is kind of an antidote to apathy and despair for voters that may feel like, oh, well, we're going to lose, whatever our side is. There's no turning this vote around. It's a disaster, and I don't want to look. But if you can convey to them that there's more at stake that's important, critically important to our community than just who's the next governor or who's the next Secretary of State, then you can still motivate people to participate, and it can make all the difference in the world. So Prop 308 is about post-secondary ed. That's us, universities and colleges. And I'm not going to show the video for lack of time, but what 308 means is if passed, it would give every Arizona student, whether or not they had legal immigration status, the ability to qualify for in-state tuition at our 3 state universities or in our community colleges. There are some qualifying requirements. So this pertains to DACA and Dreamer students. It would give them the ability to pay in-state tuition instead of out-of-state tuition. So they had to have graduated from and spent at least 2 years at an Arizona public or private high school, or have been homeschooled for the equivalent. So they can't just have shown up here and qualify for in-state tuition. They have to have been through our schooling system. And it would also give them the ability to qualify for state financial aid. So sometimes that's in the form of tuition waivers, or grants or scholarships issued by the college or the university directly. Currently, they don't qualify for those things because those are counted as state financial aid. So even if they were 4.0 GPA high school student with all the academic honors from their high school, they ordinarily would get like the president's, what's it called, scholarship or the Regents Award and not have to pay tuition. They don't qualify for that currently. A yes vote on 308 would make them eligible for different forms of state financial aid. No vote means you're not in favor of doing that. You want to keep our current laws under which undocumented students, Dreamers and DACA students must pay out-of-state tuition, and they don't qualify for any kind of state financial aid. The other thing I like to do with the ballot measures, because sometimes people are still not really sure how they feel about things, is I just point out who are some of the key figures that are on the record supporting and opposing each measure, because sometimes it's enough just to see politically who's lining up for and against to be able to make up your own line. So 308, typically the propositions are pretty divided politically. 308, I'm happy to say, maybe I'm betraying my own bias, enjoys broad bipartisan support, more so than I frankly expected. So you'll see here Senator Tehran, Democrat, in the state Senate, no surprise, she supports this along with the mayors of Phoenix and Tucson, both Democratic leaders, the Democratic County Sheriff Paul Penzone, but also Republican Senator Barb Worsley supports it. A lot of nonprofit organizations and charities that do health and human services and family support work in our community, they support this, as well as at the bottom here, you'll see Mormon Women for Ethical Government. I've never heard of this organization before this year, but they wrote arguments about a lot of the ballot measures. So just so you know what I'm talking about and where I'm getting this from, this is not my language. I didn't write any of these ballot measures, but it's in this book. So every voter gets this publication. It's hideous and horrible to look at, but it is printed and mailed by law. It's required to be mailed to every household with a registered voter by the Secretary of State's office. It's terrible to look at. It's not user-friendly unless you know how to use it. Once somebody has shown you how it's put together and how to use it as a reference document, it's very easy to use. But most voters, when they see this horrible thing in the mail, it goes straight in the trash. And anecdotally, in my experience over the last 20 years, I'd say probably 9 out of 10 of these babes go straight to the recycling bin, hopefully recycling bin, because it looks terrible, but you have to know how to use it. And so each proposition, including 308, the first thing you'll see in this book, and it's online as well, is a technical language. And for me, that's a mistake because it's the most bewildering, hard to comprehend. It's not helpful. After the technical language of the bill, you'll see the Legislative Council's analysis. That's a staff body, a nonpartisan body that does research for the legislature. And so they'll give their summary of what the bill means, and that's very helpful. Then you'll see the arguments that people have written for and against the measures, and that's where I get this list from. It's not just people that I think are for and against it. Each of these bullet points are people and organizations that have submitted letters, and they're all in this booklet, that say why they think you should vote, in this case, yes, for Prop 308. So that's the source of the names that you're going to be seeing. And then the last thing you'll see in each ballot section is the actual language that will be on the ballot, the yes vote, no vote language. For me, that should be the first page. You should start by looking at what the yes vote means and the no vote means, then go to the Leg Council explanation. And then for me, I just say, a lot of times you can just skim the arguments and look at who wrote the arguments. And a lot of times that's all I need to make up my mind how I want to vote on things. And then I'll go back sometimes and skim the arguments to see what are the main positions that they're making. Additional supporters for 308 include several education-focused organizations that are trying to improve college going, college completion, especially focused on Latino communities and so forth. So I think a lot of you are familiar with all of these organizations. Arizona Education Association is the teachers union in Arizona, so on and so forth. So no surprise, a lot of these education focused organizations support 308, but several business organizations and coalitions also support 308. And if you're not familiar, these are organizations, the one you're seeing on the screen now, that typically support primarily Republican and conservative / business friendly policy. So these organizations on the screen now usually line up around conservative and Republican policy initiatives. But in this case, they're all strongly in favor of 308. And if you look at the arguments, they boil down to basically that passing 308 and allowing more undocumented students to get a higher ed is good for our economy, and that we need more skilled and educated workers to support our key industries. So that's essentially what their arguments in favor boil down to. And then we also have several interfaith organizations that are on record saying this is a justice and equity issue that we need to fix in our state. If you'll notice in each slide at the bottom right, you'll see page numbers. That corresponds to where you can find whatever that slide is dealing with in this booklet, and it's online as well as a PDF. So if you were interested to see what the Mormon Women for Ethical Government or the Jesuits West have to say about 308, you can see the page numbers and jump right to it. And they're brief. Anyone can write arguments. And this is something I hope maybe some of you have ideas about this, because so few people know about the arguments. They think you have to be a lobbyist or a lawyer to write an argument for or against one of the propositions, and it's not true. Anybody with $75 and up to 200 words can submit an argument and have it printed verbatim and mailed to every voter in our state. It doesn't have to be well written. It doesn't have to be make sense or have proper grammar and spelling. They will print it exactly the way you submit it. So all it takes is $75 and 200 words or less. So they're short arguments, and get it in by the deadline, and it will be printed and provided to every voter. So a lot of them are fairly brief. Yet more supporters: Creighton University School of Medicine, former Director of Health Services, and Luis Avila from Iconico. I think some of you must know Luis. And we have some individuals that are on the record opposing 308. In this case, only 3 arguments were submitted saying vote no on 308. And that includes former Senate President Russell Pierce, who was recalled by the voters back several years ago, primarily because of his virulent anti-immigration policies that many felt were bad for our state. So voters recalled Senator Pierce, Dr. Ward, the current chairwoman of the Republican Party in Arizona, and an organization I'm not familiar with, Writers USA. These 3 are the only entities that wrote arguments saying, don't vote, don't support 308, vote no. All the others that you saw are in favor. And you can read their arguments, just pages 262 and 263. Any questions before I move on from 308? Okay, next. So I mentioned I'd skip because that's 308 is actually the last proposition that you'll see on the ballot. So part of the point of doing this is to encourage voters to vote all of their ballot, because sometimes voters show up on election day and they haven't looked at their sample ballot and they're surprised at how lengthy the ballot is. It can be pages, and it can overwhelm people to say, I don't have time to look at all of this. And so unfortunately, that means the stuff at the end towards the bottom of the ballot a lot of times gets undervoted and decided by a very tiny number of voters, because all it takes to pass or fail an initiative is the majority of the votes cast. So if fewer people make it all the way to Prop 308 at the very end, that means it's a small population that will be deciding that issue. But let's go back to the top of the ticket. Prop 131 is a proposed constitutional amendment. It's one of 3 proposed constitutional amendments that want to change the initiative process. So I mentioned to you, like, if I had my idea about making it illegal for restaurant owners to keep tips, I could get that on the ballot through the citizens initiative process. And a lot of key legislation has passed by voters directly through the initiative process because where voters were frustrated about the legislature not taking action. So for example, in the last election, voters approved recreational marijuana through the initiative process. Previous to that, they approved medical marijuana through the initiative process because the legislature would not take it up. It was just too hot, too difficult for them politically to champion those issues. So voters said, well, we'll do it ourselves. Back in the 90s, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. So Prop 131. All right, I got these out of order, didn't I? It should be 129. Let me see what's going on with my slides here. 129. Not real quick. I'm gonna have to go to a different slide deck. I don't know what happened to those 3. We're actually going to start with Prop 128. Okay, so 128 is the first of 3 propositions that want to change that initiative process, the way that citizens can put questions on the ballot directly. And the reason for that is because the legislature has been very frustrated at being unable to change things that voters pass through the initiative process. They used to do this a lot back in the 90s. Voters would put something on the ballot, it would pass, and then the legislature would go change it or undo it. So voters passed the Voter Protection Act, which is what this proposition refers to, in 1996, that basically kept the legislature, it was basically keep your hands off our initiatives act. So when they passed the Voter Protection Act in 96, it prohibits the legislature from making changes to citizens' initiatives that are approved by voters unless it's to further the intent of the voters. So they couldn't anymore take the money out of a new program created by voter initiative. They couldn't just repeal it entirely like they had done before. So VPA said, once the citizens approve an initiative, the legislature has no power to change it, defund it, or otherwise alter it, except to further the will of the voters. And the legislature's been trying to undo that since then, so for 30 years. 128 is one of 3 propositions that change the initiative process, and this one would change the Constitution to give the legislature the power to change, divert monies from, or supersede, which basically means undo, an initiative approved by voters or a referendum approved by voters under certain conditions. And basically, if they can get a state or the state Supreme Court or the US Supreme Court to say that the initiative or part of the initiative is unconstitutional, then it does give the legislature the ability to undo, defund, or otherwise change the initiative in ways that don't further the will of voters. So a no vote on 128 says you don't think that's a good idea and you want to keep the current Voter Protection Act in place, which prohibits the legislature from changing, taking away the money, or undoing an initiative approved by voters. So that's the first of the 3 that want to make changes to that process. And the supporters include a lot of more conservative business organizations. They have a concern that voters tend to pass what they would call feel-good legislation without thinking through the consequences to our economy, such as raising taxes or creating a new government program that's very expensive and has to be funded, things like that. So business organizations tend to not be big fans of the initiative process. Opponents include these organizations. So again, Mormon Women for Ethical Government, League of Women Voters, One Arizona, and Common Defense, as well as the Teachers Union. Oops. Also, these grassroots community organizers also oppose 128. They say, we like our initiative process. It should be protected to maintain the ability of voters to pass laws directly. The second of the 3 that make changes to our initiative process is the single subject proposition. So this would also change the Constitution and say any future citizens initiative can only propose to make a single change to the law. And that change, whatever it's about, has to be clearly described in the title of the initiative. And a no vote means you don't think we need to have those additional restrictions on how initiatives are proposed for voters. So these are the people, you see them standing in front of the grocery stores and the post office with their clipboard saying, are you a registered voter? Are you interested in supporting an effort to blah, blah, blah? So when you go and sign their initiative, the petition, at the top of that piece of paper is the title. It can be quite long, that formally describes what the initiative is about. And so Prop 128 says everything that the initiative needs to do has to be included in the subject line, and each initiative can only make one change to the law. So I can't propose a sales tax increase to fund schools and also make it illegal for restaurant owners to keep tips. Those are 2 different things. So that wouldn't comply with this single subject requirement if 129 passes. And some of you might be confused because you might say, isn't that already the law? And I was a little bit confused on this myself. The single subject requirement is currently a law that pertains only to proposed constitutional amendments, but it doesn't apply to regular laws. So Prop 129 says we should have that single subject restriction for all ballot measures, whether they're proposed changes to our state constitution or just a law change. And you'll see a lot of the same organizations that supported 128 also support 129. And the opponents are the same organizations. they oppose 128, and they oppose 129. And the arguments are basically saying we don't need any more restrictions or handcuffs on the citizens initiative process. And the third that make changes to the initiative process. So this is going out of sequence because we have 128, 129, and two other ballot measures, and then 132. So if you're keeping notes on your worksheet, just note that I'm skipped to 132. This is the supermajority vote. Prop 132 wants to require a 60% vote in order for any proposed initiative to pass. It's as opposed to a simple majority. Currently, you just need 50% of the votes plus one to pass an initiative. This says it has to be 60%, not just 50% plus one. If the initiative, what am I doing here? I don't know what's going on with this slide, but what it should say is 60% of votes cast to approve an initiative or referendum that enacts a new tax. So if you're going to increase a tax that exists or propose a new tax, then 50% isn't good enough. We should have a higher bar in order to pass initiatives that affect taxes. So if you want to propose a new sales tax initiative to fund schools, you have to do better than a majority vote. You have to get 60% of Arizona voters to approve it in order for it to become law. So that's the proposed change in 132. And a no vote keeps our current laws. So as I said, you just need 50% of the votes cast and won in order to pass an initiative, whether or not it proposes a tax or an increase on a tax. So those are the three that relate to our initiative process. Are there any questions there before I resume? Okay, let me go back to my other slides. Sorry for the clunkiness. All right, so now we're going to 131. So this is a pretty big change for Arizona's government. So if you're from another state, you might be confused by this because most states have a lieutenant governor. We don't. In Arizona, after the governor, the highest elected official is our governor. The next highest official is our Secretary of State. And so if something happens to the governor, if they resign before their term is up, if they pass away, if they take another position and leave office, then the Secretary of State becomes governor in Arizona. And in our history, that happens about every decade. So we have a lot of history of secretaries of state becoming governor because the governor was arrested and went to jail, resigned in scandal, resigned to take another position. And most recently, this was when Democrat Janet Napolitano was elected governor. She left early to take a position as Secretary of Homeland Defense for the Obama administration. So 2 years into her term as governor, she left and was replaced by Republican Secretary of State Jan Brewer. So that's how Jan Brewer became our governor. Initially, she wasn't elected. She succeeded into office because Governor Napolitano left to go work for the Obama administration. And that was a phenomenal flip in terms of administrative policy. So we went from a progressive Democratic administration to a very conservative Republican administration. This lieutenant governor proposal to create a new office of lieutenant governor has been proposed before, and it's usually been a policy initiative that comes from the right and opposed by Democrats. But this time around, you see bipartisan support. And I think it's because there are a lot of Democrats that are still burned by losing their Democratic governor and getting Governor Brewer in her place. So in any case, a yes vote on 131 says you're in favor of changing our state constitution and our government structure to create a new office of lieutenant governor that would be elected in 2026. And that lieutenant governor would run as a ticket with the governor candidate. So instead of voting separately for them, you would be voting for either the Republican governor and Republican lieutenant governor candidates or the Democratic governor and Democratic lieutenant governor candidates, potentially Green and Libertarian parties as well for those things. So they would run as a ticket, and it would replace the Secretary of State as being next in line of succession. So if something happened to the governor, then the lieutenant governor would become governor. So the intention I think is pretty clearly to create more stability, political stability. So when and if something happens to the governor, we keep the new governor will have the same policy priorities as the governor that left. But it would keep everyone else in that same line of succession. It's just putting lieutenant governor ahead of secretary of state. The other little technical thing here is if you're appointed to your position to fill a vacancy, currently the law says you're not eligible to succeed in office. So when Jan Brewer became governor, because Napolitano left to work for Obama, she appointed Ken Bennett. Well, Ken Bennett was appointed by the legislature to serve as the new secretary of state to replace Jan Brewer. If something had happened to Governor Brewer and she had left office early, then Secretary Ken Bennett could not have become governor because he wasn't elected, he was appointed. Prop 131 would do away with that requirement and say, well, whether or not you're elected or appointed, if you're in one of these offices, you stay in the line of succession. A no vote says you don't think that's a good idea. You like having the governor and secretary of state elected separately, potentially, and often from different parties. And if something happens to the governor, the next in line is a secretary of state. And we don't need an additional lieutenant governor office. So as I mentioned, this Prop 131 has a lot of bipartisan support. So this time around, we see arguments from Republican Senator Mesnard, as well as Democratic Senator Bowie, the League of Women Voters, who typically support more progressive and liberal policies, as well as the chair of the Republican Party, Dr. Kelly Ward. So we see supporters on both sides of the aisle, and nobody wrote any arguments against 131. So that doesn't mean people are opposed to 130, are not opposed to 131. It's just that nobody that might oppose it sent in an argument. So we don't have any reasoning in the official booklet that represents a point of view that counters 131. Any questions on that? Okay, next we have 211. This relates to campaign finance. It's called the Voters' Right to Know Act. And it's all about what do we know about the people funding big dollar donations to political campaigns. So a yes vote on 211 means you're in favor of requiring disclosure and reporting for anyone giving more than $50,000 to political campaigns that are statewide campaigns, or $25,000 in local level political campaigns. So a yes vote means you're in favor of doing that and identifying the original donors of contributions of more than $5,000 in aggregate. What that means is there are intermediary organizations that funnel money to political campaigns. For example, I donate to several different candidates through a platform called Act Blue. And so I'll give a little bit of money here and a little bit of money there to several different races and so forth. If my donations total to more than 5,000, and I'll tell you they don't, because I don't make that kind of money. But if I was somebody that could spend more than $5,000 in an election campaign on different, in several different candidates or whatever, if Prop 211 passes, then Act Blue or whatever other intermediary organization would have to report my identity. And currently they don't. So there's no way to know where a lot of these intermediary organizations that fund a lot of the advertisements you see on TV, you don't know where they get their money from because they're not required to report that. It would also create penalties for violating the law and gives the Citizens Clean Elections Commission the authority to enforce that law and create the rules for how it would be administered. A no vote on 211 means you want to keep things the way they are, and you don't believe in creating these new disclosure and reporting requirements for large dollar campaign donations. So any questions on 211? Oh, here are some supporters. Former Phoenix Mayor is Terry Goddard. Terry Goddard was actually former Arizona Attorney General as well. And Paul Johnson, League of Women Voters, former Representative Clark, and so forth. And opponents, the Free Enterprise Club and the Center for Arizona Policy. These are both conservative organizations. Any questions on 211?
It does look like we have a question. We have a question asking, can you share how social media posts or restaurants hosting political events play a role in 211?
That's a great question because the language of Prop 211 includes in-kind support. So if I owned an event space, like a restaurant with a large patio, and I normally rent that out for, let's say, $500 an hour. If I donate the use of that space so a candidate can have a rally or a press conference or a fundraising dinner or things like that, I may not be donating money to that campaign, but I'm donating in-kind services, because otherwise they would have to pay like $1,500 to use my space. So that would count. That would count as a $1,500 in-kind service or donation. So I'm not giving the money, but it still would put me closer to being on that threshold of being disclosed or not. So that's like restaurants, social media posts. Social media posts are a little tricky because it's hard to argue what the in-kind value of social media posting might be. I don't really know much about that at all, so I'm in danger of like saying something that's just patently not true. But I think like event venues or any services, like if I was going to print things for a candidate or a ballot measure campaign and not charge them for it, if I was going to make up t-shirts or provide breakfast for volunteer training, whatever the costs of doing that are, count as in-kind services if I'm not charging for it. Social media posting is really just speech. So maybe I'm misunderstanding the nature of the question there. So for us as public employees, it's just keep in mind that just because we work for the government, the public university, we don't lose our free speech rights, but we have to be conscientious about when and how we express our political opinions, especially in elections years. So myself in particular, because I do so much work around voting in elections, I have to be really cautious that it's obvious, it's very clear to anyone I'm giving my opinion to about any candidates or propositions that I'm speaking on my own behalf, that I'm not speaking as director of the Congressman Ed Pastor Center. I'm not speaking on behalf of ASU. So I can go to legislative hearings. I can go to city council meetings. I can go to school board meetings. I can go anywhere and say whatever I want. But I always have to start by saying I'm speaking on my own behalf as a private citizen. And all of you can do that too. So that extends to social media as well. So I have to be careful about how and what I post so that there's no way that it can be mistaken. Any Facebook post or Instagram post that I make that's political, expresses a political opinion, it has to be obvious to whoever's seeing that I'm speaking on my own behalf, and not, I have to be really careful to not let it be done in a way that might confuse people to think, oh, this is a post representing the Pastor Center or ASU or things like that. Okay, let me see here. Prop 128, if an initiative is challenged or found, does entirely up to this. Yes, so if the state or the US Supreme Court finds that an initiative is entirely unconstitutional or part of it is unconstitutional, then it goes to the legislature and they have complete discretion to make whatever changes they want to make to fix the thing, which could be entirely just striking it and say, okay, that law is not a valid law anymore. Or it could say, well, the funding provided to create this service, we're going to offer rides to doctor's appointments for senior citizens. Well, they provided a funding mechanism that's insufficient because they didn't anticipate how much demand there was. So the legislature might be able to create a new funding schema or reduce the scale of the program so that it can match whatever money is available. Or they could just say, we're going to eliminate this law entirely. Currently, if the Supreme Court finds an initiative illegal, they can either invalidate part of the law or just invalidate the law, but there's no opportunity for the legislature to make any fixes. So this happened a few years ago with the Save Our Schools initiative when the voters overwhelmingly approved an increase to the sales tax to fund K-12 schools. Also, what was the other thing that happened? It's happened several times in the last few elections where voters pass an initiative and part of it gets struck down through court hearings, where the state court will say this part of this law can't be enforced because it's unconstitutional. So currently the legislature can't fix anything. It's just that part of the law can't be enforced, or the whole law sometimes entirely gets stricken. So California. What language are the informational book? Okay, so this booklet I mentioned, it's online, and you can get copies, you can just request copies in English or in Spanish. You can get large print copies and Braille copies. It's online as a PDF in English and Spanish. They provide oral copies on audio. Well, they used to do tapes. I don't know how they do it now, but they translate it into native languages as well. And it's a federal requirement. So the National Voting Rights Act includes a provision that says in any election jurisdiction, if you have a certain population percentage that speaks another language other than English as their primary language, then that jurisdiction must provide all election information in that language as well. So in Arizona, that primarily is English and Spanish and several different tribal languages. In California, they have to provide a lot of Asian languages as well. So it just, depending on where you go, you might see election information provided in different languages. That's not them being nice, that's them complying with federal law. All right, any other questions? I'm missing some slides. I don't know what happened to my slide deck. I apologize about that, but that worksheet you have, has links to the full slide deck. I put it on a Google Share Drive so that anyone can access it, and you can download it and make changes to it. If you only want to talk to people about one or two of the initiatives, then you can do it that way. Let me try and find the correct one. So the Google Share Drive has the complete comprehensive slide deck with all of the propositions. But there are a few more I did want to talk about. Let me just open it real quick. See what it's saying. This is the one. So I would say for our Latino community, it's especially important for them to know, because a lot of people, I'm surprised, don't know that Prop 308 is on the ballot and can affect tuition and state financial aid for undocumented students. If you don't talk to voters about anything else but that one, I think you're still going to be doing a great service. Just to yet, especially young Latinos know, they have the opportunity to change this thing in our state. However they feel about it, it's important for them to know that there may be other things on the ballot they feel powerless about, but here's one thing that could make a big difference. And I found my good slides. So if you'll bear with me another second, go back to that. So this is my fault because I create different versions of this presentation for who I'm talking to. And I have shortened versions that have less information, and I got myself all messed up. All right, so let me just go through. We did 131. I see it's messed up here. 211, 308. Well, it's messed up, but I do want to talk about the judges, because this is the other thing that confuses people. So when you get your ballot, and a lot of you, if you're mail ballot voters, you've already received it, may not have opened it. A lot of voters are surprised and annoyed by the lengthy list of judge names that we're asked to vote on in our state. And they'll say, well, how are we supposed to know whether judges should keep their job or not? So where this comes from is in our state through a citizen initiative process back in the 70s or 80s, I think it was. Voters passed what was called the merit selection process for judges because they didn't want judges to be running for office like politicians. Voters in our state thought it was a bad idea for judges to have to go around and raise money and ask for donations from lobbyists and attorneys and other people that later on are going to be in their courtrooms. They said that's just kind of setting things up for corruption. So voters decided on the merit selection process by which judges are appointed by the governor through a nomination process. So the Arizona Bar Foundation and the Judicial Nomination Committee work together to prepare a list of nominees for the governor based on all kinds of qualifications. And the governor appoints them to their first term as judge. After they complete their first term, then they're on the ballot for voters to decide whether or not they get to keep their job. And so the information provided to voters is actually in the first section of this book on the ballot measures. It starts with what's called the Judicial Performance Review. And where that comes from is basically a way to grade all of the judges. So you'll see for any judge on your list, how they scored. So each judge is assessed, and you won't be able to read it, but it's in here on categories of legal ability. Do they know the law? Integrity, are they honest? Are they fair? Communication skills, do they communicate well with plaintiffs and defendants and attorneys and court staff? Judicial temperament, that can include a lot, and administrative performance. So you can be great and smart, but if you're not putting in your papers on time, if you're not executing your administrative duties as a judge, that can have legal consequences. So the judges are scored in all of those categories by the Judicial Performance Commission. And part of how they do that is by observing the judges and by surveying everyone that comes in front of the judge. So if you're involved in any kind of court action in Arizona, even if it's just changing your name, plaintiffs and defendants and attorneys and court employees all get to submit survey responses about that judge and say, is this judge fair? Do they know the law? Are they efficient? Do they have professional temperament and all those kinds of things? And almost always, most of these judges score very highly, but there's a few this year that scored exceptionally poorly, and where the Judicial Commission, in fact, is not recommending that they keep their jobs. So there's a summary on here. I should have had it page marked. But there's a summary in the Judicial Performance Review that lists all the judges and whether or not the commission thinks they should keep their jobs. So it's a source of information for voters. It's much better than just guessing. But most of the time, voters don't know anything about that process and they skip all of those judges. But it's really important to make informed votes about that because it affects people, their real lives when they come in front of these judges, especially family court, I'll tell you. So I hope you will judge the judges and decide on one or more of these ballot measures that you care about and that you want to talk up with your students, with your family members, and talk about how you're voting. So every year now on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, I let people know, I say, I've done my research. I've got strong opinions about these things. If you'd like to know how I'm voting, I'm happy to share my recommendation list with you and why. And every year that list grows. I think I send it out to a few dozen people now every year. So let them know. The registration deadline has passed, but you can get all of this information from the Secretary of State's homepage. It's linked right on, if you just Google Arizona Secretary of State and go to the homepage, you'll see that booklet, the PDF versions of it in English and in Spanish. And it just takes walking someone through it so they know how to use it. But that's the presentation for now, ending right at 1. And now I'd just like to invite any discussion about any of the specific ballot measures, the voting process, voting requirements, anything like that, especially for people that are new to Arizona, because we do things quite different from a lot of other states. So there's a question here. Is there something regarding the chief of staff of the governor being the lieutenant governor? That's a really good question. So previous versions of that proposition that wanted to create a lieutenant governor position, they intended to have it replace the Secretary of State. So earlier iterations said we're going to have lieutenant governor, and it's basically they're going to take over what was the Secretary of State's office and make that lieutenant governor. This version doesn't do that. It doesn't do anything to the Secretary of State's office. Secretary of State will still run elections, still oversee business filings and things like that. The lieutenant governor will, according to the backers of it, act more like what is currently the chief of staff for the governor's office, just kind of supporting the governor's agenda and that sort of thing. It's not really that well detailed in the description. So this is one of those issues that would have to be further defined. If voters pass it, then it goes to the Secretary of State's office and the legislature to work together on writing the rules and the regulations that pertain to the new law. That happens a lot, where the initiative doesn't address everything that needs to be figured out in order to implement a new law. And that's one of those things, like what specifically is the role and responsibilities of the lieutenant governor? And will they have their own staff? Will they have their own budget? All of those things will have to be figured out. Anything else? Okay, the final thought I would leave for you. Many years ago, voters passed an initiative called the Youth in the Booth Initiative to give every voter the right to take anyone of their choice into the polls with them. And it was specifically passed to encourage more parents to bring their kids into the polls when they go to vote on election day. Well, now we know that the vast majority of voters in Arizona vote by mail. It's well over 60%. And in Phoenix alone, I think it's closer to 70% of voters vote by mail or vote with mail ballots and drop them off on election day. So I mentioned that because there's less opportunity now to bring your kid or someone that's a new voter with you to observe you voting. But I would say if you're going to vote by mail, then make a plan to sit down with that person, with your kids or with your neighbor, maybe have a party and just talk through it, have everyone bring their ballots together and talk through each section and decide together and make it a communal experience. But it really is important to share the voting process with young people so that it takes the mystery and intimidation factor out of it to see you work through it. And it makes it more likely that they can see voting as something that they can do, that it's not so hard, that and they can start to figure out where are the sources of information that will help me make up all these decisions. So thanks, Rachel, for again including the link to the document that has the actually correct slide deck with all of the presentations, all of the propositions in it, as well as the slides. If you wanted to take the slides and download them and make them your own, make any changes, feel free to do that as well. Other final discussion or opinions or questions? And let me put my email address in the chat. I encourage anyone to reach out to me with any questions about voting. I'll also put the election hotline number in here. So if you have anyone that has questions about their voter registration status or the mail ballot process or where to go on election day or any of those things, this number here, the 506-1511, is the county recorder's election hotline. So you can call that in real time and get a response. Am I registered to vote? I haven't received my mail ballot. Can I drop my mail ballot off? Is there still time to mail it in? All those kinds of things. So as we get closer to the election, you may have a longer wait time. But that's the official source of information, is that hotline. But feel free to reach out to me directly by email. If you like any of these documents, I can send them to you directly, or give you a link through a Dropbox or Google Shared Drive, or anything else. Or if you have a group you'd like me to come speak to about any or all of this, like I said, I love to do these and I love to engage in that conversation. So thanks for having me. Yes.
About that, I have one question, if we have time. I've been seeing some news recently about armed and masked ballot watchers who are sort of positioning themselves by ballot boxes in our state of Arizona. And there's a lot of concerns that they're trying to intimidate voters. And I'm just wondering if you have any information on that or any comments about that.
It's more of a concern than ever before. I mean, we've always had some incidences of voter intimidation in our state, and a lot of election officials are quite concerned this year for a big increase in those kinds of shenanigans. I would just say if you see something like that and you don't feel comfortable or you feel threatened or intimidated, or someone comes up and challenges your eligibility to vote or anything like that, you can either notify a poll worker in the voting location that you're going to that's happening, and they have a quick response team that they can bring out, or you can call the police directly and say, I'm here to vote, this is going on, I don't feel safe, I don't feel comfortable. The police will respond. There's also independent organizations like Election Protection, the Election Protection, let me Google it real quick. They will send emergency response teams as well to document what's happening. Election Protection Network, I think it is. Election Protection AZ. Yeah, so there's a hotline there. It's just electionprotectionaz.org is the website. So they have teams ready to deploy if something's going on. They'll go there and they'll take pictures and they'll do video and they'll talk to people and collect documentation that is important. If it needs to be charges pressed and prosecuted, then it's important to have that documentation from independent observers to say, yes, we arrived at 10:59 and we witnessed this, it was this individual, and so on and so forth. They'll take license plate numbers, all of those things. So it's important to know that, but just remember electionprotectionaz.org. I'll type it in the chat here as well. They're the ones that can come out, but you can also just call the police. protectionaz.org. Or if you get into the polling place, if there's not a line, you can just go right into the polling place and alert a poll worker, and they're supposed to respond immediately. If you haven't been a poll worker, oh, here's another thing. Please consider working at the polls on election day. There is never enough poll workers. The average age of people that work at the polls is 73. And so that pool of poll workers is shrinking quickly for lots of reasons. But one of the reasons is poll workers tend to do it every year. It's a big thing for them. And they're just getting too old and frail to keep up with 14-hour day. Sometimes you have to be there at like 5 in the morning, and you may not get to leave sometimes, depending on traffic, voting traffic. You may not get to leave until 10 p.m. at night. So that's hard for senior citizens to do. We need younger people with more stamina to work at the polls and that are not afraid of technology. So please contact the county recorder's office if you or anyone you know might be interested. It's not a volunteer position. You're actually paid about $150 for the training and the service that day. And you can be as young as 16. So if any of you have teenagers that are getting on your nerves because they don't have anything to do, sign them up to work at the polls. It looks great on their resumes when they're applying for scholarships and things like that, that they've done their civic duty. And they'll probably not want to do it, but once they're in there, it's a fascinating process, and they get really like super into voting and election stuff. And it's good pay. If you're like 49, like some of us, $150 for a super long day is not that enticing. But if you're 16, $150 is pretty good scratch. So get those teenagers to work, and they're also not afraid of computers. So that's another reason why we need more young people. There is a high school program. So if they need to miss classes, it's called Step Up, and you can find that on the county recorder's website. It's a process to get their school's permission or approval for them to work at the polls. And there's a special need for bilingual poll workers. So if you speak Spanish, there's an additional training you can go to and get paid extra to be a bilingual poll worker. And that way they'll know that you're available to deploy to a location where they need more Spanish speaking assistance. It's fun. So everyone should do it at least one time. Okay, thanks everybody. There's no other questions. I really appreciate your comments and questions. And really just talk it up. The point is just give people enough information to care about the outcome of the election, and they'll jump through whatever hurdles they need to jump through to get to it. And that's our community. So thanks, everybody.